So let's start with thinking about consequentialist thinking. Bentham introduces utilitarianism for reasons. He thinks this gives you all sorts of advantages. And there are some advantages to thinking of things in utilitarian or more broadly consequentialist terms. By the way, what's the difference? A consequentialist thinks that all moral value in the end comes down to the consequences of actions, directly or indirectly. And a utilitarian says, and those consequences are pleasure in the absence of pain. But you don't have to add that. You could say satisfaction of desire is relevant. You could say keeping promises is relevant. There are all sorts of things you could count as consequences. David Sosa actually has a really nice paper called Consequences of Consequentialism, where he's arguing that the consequentialists, in a way, can be very liberal about this. Somebody says, hey, but what about rights? They could say, well, violating a right is a consequence. Okay, so anyway, there's a lot of flexibility, more so than you might initially think in this theory. Now, what are some advantages of thinking about things this way?
It's less open to interpretation in some ways. It's harder if you can say, well, clearly this is going to hurt these people more than these other people. Everyone that's a consequentialist should get on board with that.
Okay, good, good. It does have certain pretty direct implications in a way that you might worry about other theories not having them. So, for example, take a case where, I don't know, I just walk up to someone, some random person in the hallway. I don't know, they're not doing anything wrong. I just walk up and slap them across the face. Okay? Now, the consequentialist can explain what's wrong with that from a moral point of view. It caused pain, right? There was no course, even if I enjoyed it, it's unlikely that my enjoyment is going to counterbalance their pain. Very easy for us to agree on consequentialist grounds. That's wrong. Now, what about Kant? Kant has to say, well, what was your maxim? Could I universalize that maxim? Was it slap anybody you feel like slapping? Could a rational being want to live in a world where everybody went around slapping anybody they felt like slapping? Etc. And it seems like, I don't know, it's kind of a complicated question, right? What about a virtue ethicist? Okay, they would have to say, well, this is not something a virtuous person would do. But now, why exactly? Suppose I say, it is what a virtuous person would do. Men of virtue go around slapping people. I mean, what's the argument against that exactly? Now, it's not, I'm not saying that it's a very plausible point. I'm just saying that in virtue theory or in a Kantian theory, this actually looks kind of morally complicated. From a utilitarian point of view, it's not morally complicated. Super easy to say what's wrong with it. So Bentham is introducing it partly to say, look, there is more objectivity to all this than a lot of people think. Look at the consequences of the action. Are they good effects or bad effects? And if it's a kind of action we're thinking about, does that tend toward good effects or bad effects? Does it make people happy? Does it make them unhappy? That's something that we can talk about, and we have pretty direct intuitions about in a lot of cases. Maybe, if we knew enough neurophysiology, we could actually measure it. So that's... Ooh. Some people get upset about cell phones going off, but I kind of find it entertaining. I think it adds to the communal happiness. So I like it. What are some other advantages of this? I mean, we've got some degree of objectivity, and we've also got a kind of clarity. It's really clear that certain things are morally good and other things are morally bad based on their very evident effects. So what else? Yeah? Ah. Okay, yes, we can, in talking about the tendencies of actions, draw a distinction between this particular action and the general kind of action. And so a lot of people will complain that the utilitarian will let you get away with anything. In principle, stealing someone else's child could be okay as long as this produces net happiness. But it seems to me both Bentham and Mill would say, no, you have to think about the tendency of this kind of action. And clearly that's bad. And so in general, they're going to say, I don't care if in this case you got morally lucky and it worked out for the best. Maybe you stole someone's child and the next day that parent got run over by a bus, and you brought up the child very well. Well, gosh, you got morally lucky, but still what you did was wrong. It's the kind of thing that would tend to have a bad effect. And so you're right, the utilitarian can draw that distinction, and that can be helpful sometimes of saying why, look, even if you think it worked out okay here, it's not okay. Bentham's main argument actually is that it helps us resolve conflicts. So think about cases of moral conflict. Sometimes there are easy cases. There's the case from Plato's Republic. So you've borrowed a knife from a friend. We've talked about this case, I think, earlier. The friend wants it back. You promise to give it back when he wants it back. So he knocks on the door, asks for it back. You say, sure. And let me go get it, or something like that. And you say, why do you need it? And he says, you know, neighbor's dog barking all night. Gonna kill that dog and then kill that neighbor. Now, do you give it back to him? Well, Plato says, no. Okay, it should be the thing where you say, no, I'm not going to give it back to him under those circumstances. Yeah?
There is like an aspect of you ask why they want it back. If a person says, like, I don't have to tell you, how does that factor into the decision? And does someone have the obligation to tell you why they want their possession back? Because like if you go to a bank,
Right.
like ask for $1 million if you have it, and they can't technically ask you why. Or like a lot of surveys, there's like questions beyond what is federally mandated.
Right.
So like how does that change the
Well, that's actually a great question. I mean, what if they don't tell you why they want it back? In fact, why would you really ask? I mean, presumably they're not going to volunteer this information. And so why would you even ask this? Hey, you borrowed my knife. I need it. Can I have it back? I mean, it seems like that's enough, right? And so it is a legitimate point. We don't want to construe this in such a way that you have to go around asking people before you fulfill obligations to them. You know, the university says, well, you owe us now the tuition money. Well, why do you need it? I mean, good question, by the way, but that's a separate, yeah, we don't want to sort of say, oh, yeah, of course you should ask that and start evaluating and say, well, I don't think that's a good enough reason, you know, and so forth. So yeah, that's a legitimate point. And certain things it might not even be good to ask. Maybe there are laws against in employment considerations asking certain kinds of questions. You can't ask a woman applicant whether she's planning to have children, for example. And there are all sorts of other things you cannot ask. So there are real boundaries to that. But also, what if now you actually do ask in this case, and the person says, that's none of your business? Now, it seems to me you have no particular reason not to give it back to them. If they're really showing signs of irrationality, maybe you do. You know, do they say, it's none of your business? Or do they say, that's none of your business? Maybe that's relevant. I don't know. But anyway, yeah, I think that you're right to say this is a little subtler than Plato's making out. Now, some moral conflicts, on the other hand, even if this is not one, some of them seem very easy, right? But actually, let me go back, before I leave that example. Notice what you're pointing out. You're saying, in thinking about the consequences of this, we don't just think about giving the consequence of giving the knife back to the person. Yeah, that's bad. He's going to go and attempt to murder a dog and a human. However, we have to think about the tendencies of this kind of action. What happens if we say you can start quizzing people about their need for the things you actually owe them? And we might say, actually, that's a kind of action. I don't know if I want to encourage that tendency. And so that seems legitimate. Are there any easy cases of a moral conflict? Well, think about Kant's example of the murderer at the door. The person who makes it very clear that they are looking to kill someone, and you're hiding that person. The utilitarian's going to say, yeah, of course you shouldn't tell them. Okay, that's going to have bad effects. And sometimes, at least, Bentham is saying, look, these moral conflicts are easy to solve. And what are you doing when you do it? You think a life is more important than a lie. You're assessing the consequences, and you're thinking about their relative values. You're putting them on a scale and saying one matters more than another. Well, let's think about what are some other conflict cases, real conflict cases. I mean, I assume you've never had to hide a murderer from, or rather, hide a victim, potentially, from a murderer. And you haven't had murderous friends come around and ask for weapons back, so I hope. So what are some moral conflicts you actually encounter? Yeah.
Like, if you know someone who's, like, cheating on someone, or you're, like, kind of cheating on someone and stuff. I mean, that's
Ooh.
not, like, harder.
Yeah. No, good. Okay, yes. So, yeah, you happen to know that your friend's partner is cheating on them. Okay? Do you tell them or not? That can feel like a case of moral conflict. Yeah.
Like there's like an enemy base, but there's civilians there too. Like, do you airstrike it or not?
Good. Another example. You've got this enemy base. It has real military significance, but there are civilians around it. If you attack it, bomb it, whatever, you're going to kill civilians as well as military personnel. So what do you do about that? Those are very hard cases in some situations. Now, how do we think about them? Let's start with the simpler case, in a way, of the friend, or at least it looks simpler. I'm not sure in the end it really is. But what would you think about if you were thinking, should I tell my friend that they're being cheated on?
Ideally, yes, but sometimes people, like, they devote their life to, like, relationships. And,
What?
like,
Yeah.
like, some of my friends, they get, like, really obsessed with their boyfriends. And you may not want to tell them because it'll, like, ruin everything, and they'll, like, never trust a guy again.
Okay. Notice what you're doing. You're thinking about the consequences. You're thinking, well, how much does this person value the relationship? Would they want to know? What is it going to do to them, right? And to their future relationships if I reveal this information? What will it do, for that matter, to our friendship and so forth? And so you're thinking through the consequences, right? If I tell them this is what's likely to happen, how good or bad is that? If I don't tell them this is what happens, how good or bad is that? And so Bentham would say, sometimes this might be an easy call, sometimes it might be a very hard call, but you're comparing the consequences. Now, the same thing with bombing that military base with civilians surrounding it. You're going to think, well, what? How important is the base? How many civilians? Is there any way we can avoid this? You're going to be thinking through consequences of the various options. And he said that's exactly the right way to think about it. Sometimes it's easy. It's like, yeah, there are 1 or 2 civilians, but this is crucial to the war effort. Sometimes it might be, wait, there are tens of thousands of civilians, and actually this is of minor military significance. And so sometimes it's clear-cut, sometimes it might be a really hard call. Well, Bentham's point is then, this can serve as a method for conflict resolution. Nobody else really has that. What would Aristotle say about these? Well, do what the virtuous person would do. But what would the virtuous person do? How do we know that? And the same thing with Kant. Well, try to take whatever rule you would apply here and apply it universally. Could a rational person will to do that in all such cases? But again, what is the rational person going to think about when they think about that? So it looks like in those theories, it's just hard to come up with an answer. But in utilitarianism, you at least know what to do to get an answer. Well, all those are purported advantages. But now, there are some disadvantages. Last time we were talking about psychological factors that can make it hard to do the calculations. But there are other problems, normative problems. Does utilitarianism give us the right answer? Maybe yes, it gives us clearly wrong answers. In fact, I've seen some philosophers praise utilitarianism by saying, it's the first moral theory that was clear enough that you could tell that it was definitely wrong. But now, what is the general, we'll just say problems, but by that here, I mean cases where it's at least questionable whether the utilitarian comes up with the right answer. So let's think through some problems like that. What are some difficulties where you might say, I don't know if this is the right solution? Yeah.
This is a, like, physical example, but it's like having one hand in the fire and one, like, hand in a freezer. So, like, on average, you're comfortable. And that's kind of like applying like utilitarianism to, like, you could have an extreme, like, amount of bad and an extreme amount of good, but on average, you're okay.
Ooh, okay. Yeah, this person's doing fine. One hand is in the freezer, one hand is in the oven. Their average temperature is just right. Yeah, there's an example I just read of, grandma is at a constant 70 degrees versus grandma is at 140 degrees for a day and then at 0 degrees for a day. She's going to be a lot better off, right, at 70 degrees than at these extremes, even though the average temperature is the same. Yeah.
Could you just say, like, past, like historical, like for, like, slavery or something, for example, where, like, everyone thought it was okay, or, like, and then obviously it's not. Yeah. Like, for this.
Okay, yeah, well, that's a good point. we have changed our attitudes about all sorts of practices. And actually, that points to an important motivation for both Bentham and Mill. They were reformers. Remember, Bentham started this group he called the Philosophical Radicals. He thought this gave you a way of evaluating not only particular actions, but institutions. So John Stuart Mill himself actually was a crucial part of the reason that Britain did not enter the US Civil War on the Confederate side. It was being significantly harmed by the Union blockade of the South because its textile industry depended on Southern raw materials. And Mill arguing, in fact, it's part of what motivated him to write On Liberty. That was really, in a sense, intended as an anti-slavery tract to say, on utilitarian grounds, clearly this institution is wrong. Bentham was a reformer against capital punishment. The reason that flogging and, to a large extent, I should have said corporal punishment, floggings, other sort of bodily punishments were abolished in Britain largely through the efforts of Bentham and other people motivated by his way of thinking about all this. They caused far more pain than benefit. So they would say, this is something that actually has this as an advantage. It explains why those things are wrong, and it gives us a tool for reform, for saying, hey, it's not just your ordinary intuitions or your concept of a virtuous person. Maybe your concept of the virtuous person is somebody who does, or at least could, own slaves, but they're saying, I don't care, that's wrong. Yeah.
How are we supposed to quantify pleasure and pain?
Okay, I think this is related to your question. So one is, how do we quantify? We do have to put things on a scale, after all, right? The whole idea, boom, is to put things on a scale like that. But that means we have to come up with some way of comparing these. It's not enough, actually, to just do a kind of comparison. We say, well, this is better than that. That kind of ordinal comparison, just better than, will not give you a rational answer. That's something that Kenneth Arrow proved in 1951. You have to have cardinal numbers. You have to have some way of actually saying, this is how happy I am, 51 utils, or something like that. And if you can't do that, you're in trouble. But I think your point is also that we've got this gap between pleasure and pain. The idea is supposed to be they're on the same scale. And I think we raised the question of whether that's really appropriate before. But one way of seeing that is to say, well, aha, yeah. Exactly. We hate pain more than we enjoy pleasure. So suppose, I mean, one nice way to tell you this is, I offer you a job. I say, I'll pay you $50,000 a year. Or, I'll offer you this alternative. At the end of the year, we'll flip a coin. And if it comes up the way you call it, then I'm going to pay you $76,000 a year. But if I win the toss, you only get $25,000. Now, if you're thinking about the expected payoffs, you might think, oh, I should take the deal because the average is a little higher than 50 since, but in fact, would you do that? Almost certainly not, right? Now, if you think it's your initiative, you think, oh, it's a question of sales commissions or something, maybe you do. Maybe you say, I've got self-confidence, I'll do it. But if it's a coin flip? Now, suppose I make it even worse. I say, yeah, okay, $101,000 if you win the toss. Nothing. Oh, you're even less likely to, right? Now, suppose I say, I'll pay you $150,000 if it comes up in your favor. But you owe me $49,000 if not. Then you're going to say almost certainly, wait, what? No. Now, think about this sort. I offer you a deal right now. I say, let's flip a coin. I'll pay you $1,001 if it comes up heads, but you pay me $1,000 if it comes up tails. Now, maybe you do it, right? It depends, in a sense, how much you love gambling. But most people, even though the average is a little better off for you, are going to say, no, gaining $1,000 isn't as important to me as potentially losing $1,000, right? And the same kind of thing is, look, I'll pat your head, that will give you some pleasure, but I'll also slap you. Would you rather I pat your head and slap you? Either order, you can pick. Or just leave you alone. Almost everyone says, oh yeah, leave me alone. And so we tend to think, yeah, these are valued differently. There's an entire field that is devoted to studying this and understanding how we think about risks in this way. It's called prospect theory. And from one point of view, it's within a utilitarian framework because it's thinking about consequences. But from another point of view, it's saying, look, it is not nearly so simple. And in fact, there's a further danger here because sometimes I can describe the situation in ways that involve a loss, but describe the same situation in a way that looks like a gain. Sort of the glass half full, glass half empty problem, right? I say, hey, you know, you wanted a beer, but there wasn't that much left in the keg, so it's half empty. You're going to say, what? But if I say, well, there was a little left in the keg, it's half full, you're going to say, oh, good, I get some. Okay? And in short, whether I describe something as a benefit or a loss can make a big difference. Now, if it's really physical pain and physical pleasure, pretty hard to sort of, you know, obscure the difference. But if it's a question of money or if it's a question of other things, it can look like, oh yeah, what counts as, what's my baseline here from which I'm computing what's better and what's worse? I can set that baseline in different places. And this theory means I'm going to evaluate all this differently. So that introduces a scary variability to this. Well, there are other things that people, oh yeah, go ahead.
Can I say two things?
Sure.
Okay, so the first off is like, where do you stop the ripple effect? I know we talked about this on Liberty, that it should be like relatively small, like just the person and people directly affected by it. And then the other point is, how do you judge other people's subject experience? You don't have that. You can't feel their pain.
Ah, right, okay. So we have this ripple problem, and there are a couple of ways of thinking about this. There is the rippling of the effect into the future over time. That gets to your point about discount rates. And there's also this question of secondary and tertiary and so on effects. So I do something. What counts as the effects of my action? Well, let's say, I don't know, I haven't had any lunch. I'm hungry. I act grumpy to someone. Well, you might say, people are mildly annoyed with me. That's it. However, suppose now I act grumpy and someone else is having a really bad day. It's like, then I walked into class and the professor was grumpy. Oh, I think I'll jump off a bridge. Well, what about that? I mean, that seems unlikely, but what if like, yeah, gosh, the professor was grumpy. I'm tired of philosophy. Enough of this grumpy philosophizing. I want to go to a place where people are happy about what they're teaching, like heaven. Yeah, like, I don't know. Is there a subject that people are happier than philosophy that they're teaching? Hard to imagine, maybe. But anyway, yeah, you could say, well, wait, I mean, how far do I have to go, right, in assessing these ripple effects? And especially since a lot of them are small probabilities. Last time we mentioned that psychologically it's hard to get those small probability calculations right. But also it's like, well, how small do we have to get? I mean, philosophers are very creative at thinking about all sorts of wild possibilities. Oh, but what if I'm a brain in a vat and it doesn't matter anyway? So in short, like, how much do we have to think about? And we've also got this question, not only of the sort of secondary effects, but also of the future. Now, Bentham and Mill here say, look, there is a discount rate. A pleasure today is more important than a pleasure tomorrow. Remember that propinquity or remoteness criterion. So if you apply a sufficient discount rate, you can say, well, you only worry a certain distance into the future. But it's a little bit scary. The first kind is scary for parents, for example. The smallest thing you say to a child might be the thing they remember when they're late, when they're, many years older. And to the parent, it's like this minor thing forgotten, but the child remembers forever. And here, it's more like, well, what are the effects? It's actually an objection that Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia raised against Descartes, who had a kind of consequentialism as part of his moral theory. She said, look, I think this requires an infinite knowledge. After all, what if we've got two options, and we're comparing the balance of pleasure over pain, and we're thinking about the future? What if one goes like this, and what if the other kind of goes like this? And we think, well, which one produces the greatest overall pleasure? I mean, if calculus had been developed at the time she was writing, she could have said, I don't think this is a converging sequence necessarily. How do we even know that the integral of these gaps between them is computable, let alone, but forget the calculus version of this. It's enough to say, wait, how far into the future do I go? Someone once asked Zhou Enlai what he thought of the French Revolution. And he said, it's too soon to tell. It may be that he misunderstood the question, but I like to think, no, he understood what they were asking. And he was saying, look, it's only been a couple hundred years. We don't know. And, and you know, it is a question. How far in the future do you have to go to assess an action? At least it seems like it's open-ended, and that makes it... Now, all of this is suggesting, look, it might be really hard to apply. But these are, you might say, objections to the thought it gives us a clear answer. However, what about the following kind of case? The patient, I'll say, in room 105. You go to the hospital for some routine tests. Okay, you're perfectly healthy. You walk in, the doctor sees you, verifies that you're perfectly healthy, and then says, but you know, you've got a healthy liver, and that patient really needs a liver transplant. You've got a healthy heart, that one needs a heart transplant. You've got 2 working eyes. I've got a blind person who could really use those eyes. And what about that kidney? 2 kidneys, man. I can help 2 patients with those kidneys. And so on and so forth. And so they carve you up to save the lives of 5 other patients. You're dead. I mean, no, it's like, in general, there's going to be a problem in utilitarianism. How do you evaluate a human life, right? And it's one problem if you've got a life as opposed to some other consideration like money or happiness or something like that. But even just life for a life, it can be hard. It looks like, hey, yeah, I'm losing 1 life, but I'm trading it for 5 other lives. Now, isn't that a good thing? Yeah.
What if one of those patients is also like a serial killer? If I say you give a liver transplant to this guy and he goes off and he kills 10 people.
Well, okay, right. Here's actually, it raises this question, how do we know what the effects are? Whose life is being sacrificed here and whose life is being benefited and saved? What if I am killing the future scientist to save the serial killer or something? So all of that does seem kind of relevant. On the other hand, let's assume we just know nothing about that. We have no reason to believe that this patient's life is any more or less valuable in its ultimate effects than anybody being saved. Or let's suppose, for the sake of the case, they're all equal. Now, it looks like still we get this weird answer. So does the utilitarian have to say that? Yeah.
Well, I think they would say the tendency to do those things might create a society that people didn't trust hospitals, and so maybe it wouldn't be a good thing. Because the tendency to go against someone's will might lead you to a less than optimal society, or less than pleasurable, or everyone's scared.
Right. Okay, good. Yeah, now the way people sometimes set up this case, you say, look, this person has no family, no friends, nobody will ever find out what happened. But you might say, well, wait a minute. We have to think about the tendencies of actions. The tendency of this sort of action is going to be that actually people do find out about it. I mean, somebody has to be involved in these operations, right? And so the word will get out, and it's going to turn out, in general, in this kind of action, that, yeah, this is going to make people distrust the medical establishment. I know my grandfather wouldn't go to the hospital. He just said, people die in hospitals. You know, and actually, Nassim Taleb, in his book on anti-fragility, basically makes the same argument. Yeah, people die in hospitals. Stay away from them. But in any event, whatever the merits of that argument, the whole idea is, in a sense, yeah, look, if people have that attitude, then you can't help the people who need help. And so it would be a very bad thing if people distrusted doctors and thought, don't ever see a doctor when you're healthy because they'll carve you up. And use you for spare parts. So yeah, it seems to me the utilitarian does have a reply here. Yeah?
I'm saying that you apply for like settlements and stuff like that during court cases. Like, I may be in an accident, get $10 million, or you may have had your accident, maybe got like $1 or something like that, depending on certain circumstances. The same thing with like when we sentence people in court cases. Like somebody for rape may got like 5 years, somebody for like trying to rape somebody but maybe not have succeeded, maybe get like 5 months.
Right, yeah, so actually, yeah, there are a bunch of issues connected to this. One question that arises in general from a utilitarian point of view is, what do we say about punishment? Bentham thought flogging, for example, was clearly an illegitimate punishment because the pain produced was far greater than the possible good effects. But you could say, well, wait, isn't all punishment like that? I mean, sending somebody to prison, it may not be physically painful in the same way, but on the other hand, it's something that is unpleasant. It's something that's seriously detracting from the happiness of that person. Isn't the whole point of punishment to cause that problem? And then we do have a conception of justice in punishment, and it varies from case to case, and we think about the other parts of the person's life and potential consequences and all of that. But we could say, in general, that punishment is a sort of problem here. We have some conception of justice. And in fact, it can be hard to think about our intuitions about justice and what just punishment would be in terms of these consequences. Suppose the person says, but I have small children in the house. Sending me to prison is going to really harm my children. And somebody else doesn't have children, but they committed the same crime. Should they get the same punishment or different punishments? The effects might be clearly different in the two cases. Or one person says, I have lots of friends. They're going to be really unhappy that I'm in jail. But this person says, yeah, everybody hates me. I have no friends. They'll be happy I'm gone to the extent they know me at all. Do we say, okay, then you're going to jail for a longer time? So what do we do here? Yeah.
Maybe we could say the guy who brags about having lots of friends is actually probably hated by all his friends, and then his father ends up in jail. The guy who's very humble about it probably actually has lots of friends.
Maybe, although, you know, it is interesting that when people really are sentenced, people do come in and give witness to their characters and so on. And if a lot of people say, but he's a great guy, you know, that works in your favor. And if a lot of people come in and say terrible things about you, it presumably works against you. And the same thing in parole hearings and things like that. Yeah.
Don't these, like having character witnesses and having special instances for people of good character who have done good things go against the idea that justice is blind? Isn't that whole thing that people should have the same punishment?
Well, good. Exactly. You might think, wait a minute. We shouldn't take things. Look, if you've done this, then think of the Kantian point. We should treat everybody equally, right? We shouldn't say, oh, you're married, so it'll be worse on your partner, so actually, yeah, you get off easy. Or we shouldn't say that if you have, et cetera, et cetera. It might seem, look, all this is just irrelevant to the question of justice. And in general, you might say, it's hard for the utilitarian to really give you an adequate theory of justice. You might think, here would be an example. Suppose there's something clearly unjust, but that actually produces a net benefit. Some people have argued, for example, that in certain very special social situations, slavery was actually morally justifiable because it worked better than the alternative in that kind of economic setting. I think this is probably false, but suppose it were true. Would that be a justification for it? That's something that would bring out this tension between the utilitarian consideration and justice. Yeah?
I mean, it deals with context too. So murder and self-defense and then murder and like that's been complicated is two different things. Because I've had people that had self-defense murder that went to jail for the same amount of time as somebody that did murder like intentionally. You know?
Okay, good. So, right, think about killing someone. The effects might be the same, even though one is actually done in self-defense, one is premeditated and malicious. You might think the effects are the same in these two cases if we build the cases right, and yet we surely don't want to say. Now, again, the utilitarian can say, but I'm thinking about the tendencies of actions. The tendency of self-defense is actually positive. The tendency of malicious, premeditated murder is clearly negative. So you can always back up and say, however it works out in this particular case, we think about the tendency of that kind of action. And we think, for example, in your case, to give these two people the same punishment, even if the effects in this particular case are the same, is somehow wrong because the kinds of action are so different. Yeah?
If the tendency of punishment is to deter future crimes, you could also make a utilitarian argument that it doesn't matter if the person that you're punishing actually committed a crime, as long as it continues to deter crime.
Yeah, good. Scapegoats. murder has been committed. You're the police chief. You're in charge of finding the killer. In fact, you can't find the killer, and people accuse an innocent person, and you have the evidence to show that they're innocent. But the crowd is furious. They're rioting. They're going to burn the jailhouse down to try to get at this person, and a lot of people are going to die in the ensuing riot. So do you punish and convict the person who is innocent for the sake of stopping the riot? It seems like justice says, no, you can't do that. But hold on, it might be that far more people will die if we don't do this. And so maybe it could look like it's a net benefit to have a scapegoat. Now again, you can think, wait a minute, what about the tendency of this kind of action? Whenever there's social trouble, give in to the mob and just blame an innocent person. That seems like a terrible rule, right? For one thing, it encourages mobs to go around and start blaming innocent people. But, so I do think there's a response you can give here, but at least at first glance, it looks like it is possible for this kind of thing to be justifiable. There's another point, closely connected to all this, rights. Do you have a right to the money in your wallet? Suppose I say, that homeless guy over there could use that money more than you could. I'm going to rob you and give it to him. That's cool, right? I think the answer is no, it's not cool. I can't take from you and give to a person who needs more because there's a net benefit. And again, you could say, well, think about the tendency of the kind of action. But it seems like that's a weird way of looking at it. Really, isn't it a question of, look, you have a right to that. I can't do that. Similarly, can I murder an innocent person if I think we'll all be better off as a result? I think this person's nasty, and we'll all be happier if they're gone. I know people like this. It's like, yeah, the world would be a better place without this person, right? So let's just do this. Now, sometimes you might think that's okay. Like, ooh, if you were like the attempted assassins of Adolf Hitler, maybe they were right. The world was going to be much better off without him. So maybe and so the utilitarian will say, yeah, there can be cases like that where it is justifiable. But again, there's reason to fear that, wait a minute, in general, that doesn't seem like a good thing. When I first moved to Texas, a Houston legislator put out a survey to his constituents, and one of the questions was, should the state of Texas, to save money, put the people in mental hospitals to death? Fortunately, 97% said no. Yeah, we're the 3%, all right. But anyway, you say, well, look, even if it saves the state money, and I think part of the argument was, these people are unhappy anyway, right? They're just drawing down the net happiness. Better off without them. Right, no, exactly. It's like, wait, no, these people have a right to live. You can't do that. That's outrageous. And so, anyway, whether the consequentialist can give you the right answer on a lot of these questions is complicated. Now, I do want to mention two problems that are maybe, one is more a puzzle that intrigues philosophers than a real-world type situation. But nevertheless, I think it's pretty intriguing. It's called the trolley problem. Okay? And in the initial version of this, due to Philippa Foot, you're driving a trolley, and there's a fork in the track. You can steer to the left or steer to the right. There is someone who is on the track on the right, let's say. There is nobody on the track on the left. You should clearly steer toward the left, right? I mean, that's toward the left, correct. That seems clear. You're saving, here, a life is lost. Here, one is not lost. And there it seems utterly uncontroversial. But Judith Jarvis Thomson saw the significance of this in a broader context. And so she's the one who made this famous. She said, well, what if we alter the situation a bit? You are not the driver of this trolley. In fact, there is no driver of this trolley. It's out of control. It's just running down the tracks. There's nobody in it. It was at the station at the top of a hill. The brakes let loose or something. It's zooming down this track. You are a bystander. You're just out for a walk, and you see it coming down the hill. You are there at a switch point. You realize it's going to go this way unless you flip that switch. Now, you looked at the track down there, and over here are 5 people who can't get away. They're on a part of the track where there's nowhere to go. They're on a cliffside, let's say. Over here, there's 1 person on the track. Okay, so it's going to, if you do nothing, kill 5 people. You can divert it, but that means it will kill the person on the other side. Should you divert the trolley? No, notice what she's saying. Why are they? Yeah, it's intriguing when you ask people their opinions about this. It ends up varying with a lot of different things that at first glance would seem to have nothing to do with the consequences directly. So why are they on that track? That actually does matter to people. Are they just playing around on the track? They ought to know better than to do that. And so she's sort of saying, yeah, they're just idiots. Kill them. Well, maybe you're saying that. It's amusing if you're saying that. So that's one way of looking at it. It does seem to matter whether these people are just hiking there, goofing around there, whether they're workmen whose job it is to be there, whether they've been tied to the tracks by snidely whiplash and are innocent victims who can't get away, whether they are, let's say, the victims of some hate group that has attacked some other group and thought it would be amusing to tie them to railroad tracks, whether they are convicted criminals who are being punished by being run over by a train, highly creative form of capital punishment. It does seem to matter. So anyway, that's a sort of interesting question. But suppose we don't know anything about that. In fact, there are people there. We don't know why they're there in either case. And so we've got to make some snap judgment. It's coming down fast. What do you do? Yeah.
I think it depends on you, like how you value non-action and action, like negative responsibility. Like, do you value is action more of a responsibility versus more the weight on you for an action versus inaction? And so what do you value as having more of a responsibility?
Good. So yes, how many of you would flip the switch, saving the 5, but sacrificing the 1? How many of you would not flip the switch? I don't want to be sued. That's a good reason. Okay. In general, it is about that sort of breakdown. 70% of the people who can answer the question say, I would flip the switch. About 30% don't. But those percentages change if we change the case a little bit. So one thing we can do is talk about who's on the tracks and why. But another thing we can do is it your job to flip the switch? In this case, originally in Thompson, you're just a bystander. And a lot of people are like, I don't want to be involved. It's one thing to actually let those 5 people die. It's another thing to actively kill that one person by doing this. And so I think killing is a lot worse than letting die. And so I'm not willing to be involved in that way. It's not my thing. But what if it's your job? Your job is to sit there and flip that switch. Then for a lot of people who say, I wouldn't do it, they suddenly say, I would. Well, there's one last thought in my last second, which is something known as the tragedy of the commons. And this is what motivates people to think about game theory. A lot of times, a bunch of us have to act at once. Here, we're thinking about cases where you have to act. But often you have to act in the context of an organization or a group of people, all of whom are acting. And the outcome is going to depend not only on what you do, but what they do. Well, what happens then? It can turn out that each of us, even thinking as a consequentialist, tries to promote the best possible outcome. And nevertheless, each of us does that, and we get far from the best possible outcome. And so that's the kind of puzzle that started people thinking about game theory. We'll start talking about it in a serious way after the break.
With the utilitarian, like for your rights, would Robin Hood, like that idea of